You're listening to RevOps FM with Justin Norris. Welcome to RevOps FM, everyone. You know, MarTech has been a huge part of my career, especially the Marketo platform. And when you've been using a piece of software for more than a decade, you know it inside and out. It's like an old friend. You know, there's the stuff you like, the stuff you hate, the stuff that's irritating, but you tolerate it, that sort of thing. And I have a fascination for how these products actually get made. You know, like what were the decisions? What were the trade-offs along the way? How do these great products get designed? How do they catch on? And then also what makes them stagnate? What makes them lose energy? And so to chat about this, we have with us today a man who was instrumental in designing Marketo in the early days. He was literally the first employee at Marketo, building many of its first and still most beloved features. And since then, he's held product leadership roles at companies like Engagio, Treasure Data, and most recently, CrowdStrike, where he is VP of Product Design today. Glen Lipka, I am so glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Justin. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would love just to start off with a little bit of the history about how you got started at Marketo.
I had been working at Intuit in 2006, and a friend of mine named Lisa Sheehan, who's a recruiter, was putting together the founding team for Marketo, and she thought that I would hit it off with them, but she said they didn't actually have a role for me. They were just hiring engineers, but she said, go meet with them anyway. And so I met John Miller and Phil Fernandez and David Morandi. They were still unpacking boxes from purchases they made from their Series A, you know, the desks and the chairs, and they were just putting them together in a San Mateo super tiny office. And we hit it off. And I think Phil may have liked the fact that I was a network administrator and I could run the network and install the Exchange server and do operational IT things in addition to product management and design. So I think he thought it was a bargain. So they ended up hiring me. And then right after me was Crash Tung, which is one of the best engineers I've ever worked with. Paul Abrams, who was my partner in the entire UI development. Wei Lu and several other people who became the founding engineering team. It was mostly like me and 10 engineers in that first year or two, along with Kelly Abner, who was the first marketer using Marketo, and he was working with John Miller. John had already been blogging at that point, but Kelly was my proto marketer that if I could automate what he was doing, that would be a successful product.
I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's episode, Knack. You know, I love marketing automation software, but let's be honest, the email and landing page builders are usually terrible. You can't make it nice without a developer, and marketers are going to find a way to break things or go off brand. You do not have time for that. So Knack is totally different. You set the guidelines and then give your users a building experience that's slick, modern, and beautiful. When they're done, everything goes to your map at the push of a button. And don't worry, it supports global teams, approval workflows. It's got your integrations. So head on over to revops.fm/knack. That's KNAK, and get a special offer just for my listeners. So that kind of ties into the next question I was going to ask, which is like the process that you followed. And you have shared on your blog, which I'll link to in the show notes, some of the like really early versions of Marketo when it was like an AdWords management tool, and maybe just walk us through like the seed idea and then maybe the process of getting to what we might recognize today as the Marketo platform.
Well, the first 6 months we built what is best described as a replacement for Google AdWords. Like you would use this interface instead of the Google AdWords interface because Google AdWords was too complicated. And I tried to tell David Morandi and Phil Fernandez that it wasn't going to work. That it doesn't matter how hard it was. And the reason is, if you looked at a marketer's resume at the time, it said things like, I know how to order t-shirts, I know how to make brochures, I could make our website, and I know how to use Google AdWords. It was one of the few hard skills that somebody had. And you can't just take that away and say, instead of Google AdWords, I'll just be good at Marketo AdWords, which that didn't make any sense. But they wanted to build it and they felt really strong about it. And one of the pieces that was needed was this landing page editor. And at the time, all landing page editors worked the same way. It was, you had a template, you clicked on a section of the template and it popped up a tiny MCE rich text editor. And I said, why does it have to work like that? Maybe it could be more like PowerPoint. I just drag and drop stuff. Everyone knows how to use PowerPoint. It's super easy. You just drag things around and there's nothing to think about. And because I was talking to people about their landing pages and there wasn't that much on them. It wasn't like a long, super scrolling page. But then the team, they were just like, yeah, but how does that work? That's not how HTML works. And I was like, actually, it is how HTML works. Let me explain absolute positioning in CSS. And man, the engineers, they hated CSS. So I had to be the CSS person for the first year and, explain exactly how that would work. So we launched that product and the customer said, yeah, we're not doing this Google AdWords thing, but that landing page editor, that looks really cool. I'm willing to pay for that, but I don't want the Google AdWords part. So we ended up erasing all the code that we had written for the Google AdWords thing. It had word buckets and all sorts of synonyms and antonyms and crazy stuff. And we just erased all of it. And what was interesting for years, it had search in the URL, and it was only like a vestige of that old code that we had erased. We just threw all of that away and it was just gone. And then because I had gained some credibility with the landing page editor, they gave me a little bit more room to say what we're doing next. And the use case, in essence, was pretty simple. We had a focus group and there was some marketers in the room and they were talking about these landing pages and about Salesforce. And Salesforce had an autoresponder for email. And they said, all I want is when they fill out that form on the landing page is to send them an email, wait a week, send them another email, right? Why is that so hard? And she was doing this thing with her hand, send an email, wait a week, send another email. And it made me think of Minority Report with Tom Cruise, where he had that computer interface where he's using his hands and swiping things around. And I said, wouldn't it be cool if it was like that, like a hologram interface? And the engineers were like, no, that's physically impossible. And I was like, I have a dream, man. And so I created a trick of psychology of it would feel like you're rolling up your sleeves, putting your hand into the screen and grabbing something and moving it. And just like the way that person said, send an email, wait a week, send another email. And I said, that's what Marketo is going to feel like. It's going to feel like you're a kinetic reaching into the computer and making things move. And that use case, which is really a very simple use case, you fill out the form, send an email, wait a week, send an email. That was the use case that made Smart Campaigns. That was the use case that made Marketo. But once you sit and think, what does it mean to send an email, wait a week, send an email from a landing page? How do you do that? And I said, well, first we need the landing page editor. And I felt pretty good about that. We had something. Then I said, well, we need a form editor. So I had to make a form editor to put on top of the landing page. Then it was like, well, it's going to have to send an email. So we need an email editor. And I actually was spending an enormous amount of time figuring out what HTML would even work in email clients, which at the time was just a completely Wild West. Today, you would just have your templates, but maybe it was Constant Contact. And it was me and those guys were figuring out like what stuff would work and what wouldn't work across different clients. It was very much like, what can you do in JavaScript with different browsers, except it was email and different email clients. And so I needed that email editor. And then I needed something to just glue it together to say, okay, well, I'm going to wait till they fill out the form. Then I need some way of describing the text. Now, everyone in competitive circles said, oh, you do that with a Visio-like diagram. And I asked Kelly Abner, I was like, do you like Visio? And he was like, oh, no, I hate it. This thing gets incredibly complicated and it's really difficult to manage. And God forbid you want to edit it later. You're going to break everything. But what are you going to do? It's the only thing that's there. I was like, well, I don't know. We could come up with another way. And so I just started making designs of how it could be. And I said, here's a series of steps. And One of the ways Phil Fernandez put it is the way I was designing it was as if it was a programming language, and that the Visio world was using procedural language terminology. And he called it a CISC architecture, CICS, and it was like complex instructions. Whereas what I was building was more object-oriented programming, and it was RISC architecture, random. So you can think of like an Intel chip as being a CISC chip, whereas like a little mini chip that only does Wi-Fi, like from ARM or somebody, that's a RISC chip. So the RISC architecture and the CISC architecture became our mental model of what it is that we were doing, and that very quickly what a smart campaign was started coming together as this kinetic feel from Minority Report and just this simple use case of send an email, wait a week, send another email. There were a few different influential programs. IBM had one called Rational Rows, and it kind of influenced the way the smart list works. iTunes influenced the way I thought about like a dynamic list versus a static list, because iTunes had, show me all of the songs that are jazz or show me just these 10 songs. So I was taking some cues from iTunes, from these IBM tools I'd used a decade before. But a lot of it was just like, it just made sense to me structurally. I've always designed customizable platform style user interfaces as opposed to, sitemap page by page by page structure. And it pretty quickly made sense, although I would say that Kelly Abner really didn't want to use it at first. It was incredibly buggy. Anyone who's used the first year of Marketo knows how buggy that system was. It barely hung on for dear life. It would work about as often as it wouldn't work. But the whole concept of you could do this, that it was your creativity that was creating what was happening, was so powerful that it didn't matter whether it worked or not worked. The promise was that you could do it yourself. A lot of marketers, they had a person in marketing who was the web developer. This person spoke Klingon. This person was move, I'll just do it. Don't talk to me about the website. They hated this person. They hated the web developer because they did not have that skill. They didn't have the capability of doing these technical things. And in their minds, it was like, I just want to fix a comma on the web page. Why is this so hard? Or why is it so hard to send an email? And all of a sudden, there was this tool that said, no, you could be in charge. You could do this. I think a lot of products don't understand how to connect with people and make them the hero of the story. It's not like people just want a button where it all just works. They want to do it. They want to be a part of the solution. And Marketo's entire ethos was that we're putting you in the driver's seat. You are a creative, technical person, and that you're not just ordering t-shirts. You're not just writing copy, that you can actually make experiences. It was a really big deal, and it started doing well relatively quickly.
I could tell you as a user, picking up Marketo, signed my first contract just at the end of 2011, starting using it. I went through that experience that you described. Like in the beginning, it's complicated and it's weird, but I used to tell people there's like a Zen moment that you have where all of a sudden like everything falls into place. You're like the world opens up. Like I can do anything now just by dragging these things. And it was an incredibly empowering experience as a non-technical marketer who was sort of technically inclined. Just like you said, it gave you those capabilities, and that was enormously empowering. I want to just double click because I'm really fascinated by the two visual paradigms that you mentioned. I think of it as the bowl of spaghetti model. You called it probably more charitably the Visio style, like flowchart diagram model, and then the more linear model. And it feels like people split into camps. And today, like even today, we still see, like there was Marketo, but sort of Zapier's followed a similar linear format, and Workato does. And over on the Visio side, you have Eloqua and Salesforce Flow and Tray. Do you still feel the same? Like if you had to do it all over again, you would pick this model, or do you see some strengths and weaknesses between the two paradigms?
Well, the reason to pick it in the beginning has everything to do with differentiation. So Eloqua was a big player. They were the dominant 600-pound gorilla, and Responses was also a very strong player at the time. And you can't just come in and say, hey, you know that other software you use? Well, we do about 10% of it. What are they going to do? They're going to say no. So you need something. And Bill Binch had said something very wise, which is, I need to be able to go to someone and say, if you don't have X, then you don't have shit, right? I need to tell them that. And I'll make them believe it, but it has to be plausible of like, you have to have this thing. And so what I found is some people were used to the Visio charts, and that was fine. But it wasn't like the linear was worse. I thought it was better for management and maybe a little worse for giving a demo. But it wasn't like night and day. It was, you could get your job done either way. So the perfect design differentiation is something that actually doesn't matter. That's perfect. Because you don't want something that's like objectively worse. But I'll give you an example. The Tesla, who, if it wasn't for Elon Musk, I would love my Tesla a lot more. But when I first got it, there was nothing in front of my steering wheel. It was all on the screen. Now, was that better or worse? I would say you get used to it. You get used to it, but it was different. And so when I'm thinking about Marketo differentiation, I needed to create a religious war. I needed people to say, oh, if you're not into the flows, then you're not doing shit. You know, like if you're a Visio person, you're an idiot. And even though I knew they were like roughly equivalent, it doesn't matter. You need to create a war. And this is a lesson for every single tech marketer out there. Differentiation will get you half the market. We were nobody. And Eloqua was huge, a huge company. And what business did we have taking half the market share away from them? Like, we didn't. They had way more functionality. They called us Play School. I remember it was very hurtful, right? And they would call us Play School. And I'd just be like, but if we create a war and you're either on our side or not, and that led us to like a very strong community. Eloqua didn't have a strong community. And that we said, you're not just buying software, you're buying into this group of like-minded people. When you create a religious war, people want to be on your team, right? It's one team or the other. And then that's loyalty. And we did a lot of things in the beginning to get that loyalty. I remember one customer, we must have done $50,000 worth of consulting because they had multiple Salesforce instances, and we just merged them just because they were like, we can't buy your software until this gets done, and it'll take a year and a half. And we're just like, I think we could just do it. And they said, well, how much do you want? What do you want in return? I said, all I want is undying loyalty. And I remember they put me on mute, and I could tell that they were laughing at us. But then they come back and they were like, all right, Glenn, we'll give you that. And let me tell you that they gave us references. They took videos. They wrote guest blog posts. They did everything we asked them to do. And in the beginning, that mattered a lot. And so what our approach was very differentiated. But the truth is, it's not better or worse. Now, in hindsight, what I did with Playmaker, with Engagio, I think had advantages, like involve a customization layer. Like Marketo is a very set it and forget it sort of system. The marketer is completely in charge. But the SDRs could have been part of that process. They could have been like, here's a queue, I take a ticket off of the top, I customize it a little bit, and then send it on its way. And I would have done more of that. Plus, I think that I would have made more abstraction of the flows so that you can have subflows. The way that in Figma you have components that are reusable blocks. And that, yeah, you could do some reusable things like call campaign, but you couldn't see it. It was very difficult to see that high level. So I probably would have added in more of that abstraction layer.
It's funny that like 10 years later, Marketo did roll out some kind of flow charty way of visualizing things. I've never really used it or liked it because it is very high level and very basic. So clearly they felt that out in the market there was someone that wanted this and maybe wasn't buying Marketo because of it. So they threw it in to tick a box. But I just find it ironic that after all that time, they circled around and slipped that in there.
There was a UI, I used to call it fluid dynamics. It was basically the process. I'm forgetting the name that they had for it. But it was a Visio diagram. It wasn't about a flow of like send an email, wait a week, send an email. It was more like first they're a lead, then they become
the revenue cycle model,
an opportunity. Yes, the revenue cycle modeler. That did make sense to be a Visio diagram. That totally made sense. Not everything should be a flow. It's use the right tool. So the revenue cycle modeler was a Visio diagram on purpose, and it worked well in that case. And that the program flows with the green strip, that made sense also to be a diagram. But doing it for just send an email, wait a week, send an email, I think after I had left in 2015, they lost their way a little bit. They sold to private equity. I should have stayed the one extra year. That would have been very lucrative for me. I kind of missed out on that one. And once they got taken private, it was more just like shore up the functionality, get it prepared to sell to Adobe. And then once you're in Adobe, it's more of a maintenance mode.
I really want to go down that road, but I'm just curious because you mentioned Eloqua. I've had a chat on this show as well with Mark Organ, who's the founding CEO of Eloqua. And it's funny hearing the story, a lot of similarities where they started out with a completely different use case in mind and then stumbled into this thing from a different direction. I'm curious from your point of view, like this category of marketing automation didn't exist really. It wasn't a thing. What was the process like of emerging into like, oh yeah, there's this thing where we like score leads and send them emails to nurture them and like having that concept emerge?
Again, it did start off very simply. I just want to send an email, wait a week and send another email. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, what else do people want to do? And that just became more and more functions, more and more things that you could do. But it was always the same language. And the language is when something happens, I want to do some sort of response. And it was designed like a programming language. I remember in the beginning, when Eloqua was, I think it was they were a content management system. And I looked at their UI and I just thought, my goodness, it's so complicated. And it was very expensive to implement. And then when we started going, our tagline was, I think I had come up with the tagline, which easy, powerful, complete. But it was our whole ethos was, this is easier. It's simpler. It's how Salesforce beat Siebel. They just made it easier. They made it easier to self-service. And I remember them at the time tweeting something like celebrating a victory over Marketo. And I was just, it blew my mind because I'm just like, we're nobody. Why are they even saying our name? That's just telling people, oh, there's a competitor that they're focused on. And I literally responded immediately like saying, good one. You know, the last 10 you lost, but this one, nice job. And they erased their post. And I had screenshot it and I sent it back to them saying, I think you lost this. It was just, we were the cool kids and they were the old grandpa. And then they ended up paying IDEO to design a Marketo killer. And I thought, I was so flattered and so excited that it was like me versus IDEO because they're a famous design firm. And what they ended up doing is taking exactly what they have and just putting a nice paint job on it, making it look a little bit nicer. But I was just like, yeah, there's no way they're going to fix that. And I felt like it was an unfair battle. They just did not have the resources or understanding. And I knew that they were going to end up selling pennies on the dollar, which is what they did to Oracle. And then they went into their own maintenance mode. It's like when you have that energy that this is something cool and different and better, everyone gets really excited about it. I think that I had underestimated the lightning in a bottle effect at the time. The people, there were so many great people there who were like Maria Pergolino was inventing inbound marketing before my eyes. Bill Bench was inventing SaaS sales. There were so many things that I was just mesmerized by how they were happening. And I was just very lucky to be right in the middle of it. But like revenue operations or marketing operations, it's sort of like we didn't even think about it until it was already real for years. It was just more like there's Emily Salas and she's trying to solve this problem. And how do we help her solve this problem? And Generali, I remember they were very early, the first couple of customers. Like I trained our first 50 customers personally, and they would have just these weird little problems. And we'd be sitting at a whiteboard saying, how are we going to solve that for them? I remember also we invented anonymous leads. And I said to Jen Raleigh, you got to check this out. Anonymous leads are great. And she's like, Glenn, look, I know you're very excited about your anonymous leads, but I'm very busy. You're not the center of my universe. I have a job to do. And I was like, And then like 6 months later, she comes back and like, hey, these anonymous leads are great. And I was like, I've been trying to tell you that. And it's a strong lesson that just because you build some cool thing and just because you have an early adopter customer doesn't mean that they're ready for it and doesn't mean that they want to hear from you all the time. This is probably the biggest lesson from Marketo, is that more features is not why you're going to win. More features is not why you're going to be successful as a tech startup. It's never about the number of features. It's always, how does it work? Who are you? Are you creating differentiation? Are you creating a cultural mainstay for someone to latch onto? That's what matters. The number of features, I mean, you need like a minimum. You need to be able to do something. But we had I would say we pounced on Eloqua, and at the point where they had given up, we still only had half the functionality they had.
I want to talk about this dynamic that you've described, both Marketo and Eloqua going through the life cycle of a product, where it's got like innovation, energy, expansion, and then like maintenance mode. And you've listed in one of your blog posts a lot of Marketo features that went out sort of half-baked, I think, as you described it. And I've observed this. Anyone watching could see every year at Summit, there was like SEO, social, ABM. Like it was really clear, like what's the trend? What's the buzzword this year? We've got to do something for that. And then it was like a big splash, and then half quarter baked, never came back to it. So there was this, and I'm not saying this to like dump on Marketo or criticize anyone, but it's a dynamic that you can observe in the market. And it makes products suck. And that hurts me as like someone who, big part of my career is working with these products. And I wonder for your thoughts about, how does a company avoid this? And I ask this to founders that I speak to too, like, how are you going to avoid making your product suck? Because you can see it coming. Like, how does somebody avoid that rock in the water?
To me, I can peg it to 2012. We went public. And from that day forward, everything went out differently. So like in the beginning, there's a thing called PCamp in Silicon Valley, which is for product managers. And they were talking about releases. And I was like, we release every 2 weeks. And they literally almost fell out of their chairs of like, are you crazy? How is that possible? And it's because we were young and didn't know any better. And we were just doing things. And if you go back in the release notes, and I think that they're still there, the first year of release notes is me writing personally. Like, so if you look at the way the release notes are written, it's not these big stories. It's just, okay, now we have this, now we have this, now we have this, and it's fleshing it out. It's adding to the story. And then there comes a point where they start being very long and much more like flourishy. And that's the point of where professionals got involved. And at that point, there was no such thing as a small improvement. It was always a huge thing. And it was really unfortunate. And I think that the point of where it was very painful was programs. We had reached a point where it's like people are trying to do things that are really complicated. And this revenue cycle analytics is not working. People did not like it at all. And I had actually left the company for a brief period right in the middle of it. And when I came back, they were like, you got to fix our analytics thing. Everyone is upset. And when I looked at it, I was like, okay, I see the problem. The problem is that John Miller is a physics major from Harvard and Stanford, and he's incredibly smart. And he's like, everyone should be thinking about the percentage that your conversion from lead to opportunity is dropping at a precipitous rate compared to, last year's over blah, blah, blah. And I was like, that's not what people want. They want to know, how many webinars did I have? I had 6. That was it. They just wanted to know, how many programs did I run? How many things did I achieve? They weren't getting measured on like these, I described it as buckets of M&Ms where the holes would be changing sizes at different rates, and the M&Ms of different colors would be coming out of the buckets, going into different buckets. It was like fluid dynamics. And I was like, it's so complicated. It's not what people want. They just want to say the basic thing. How many mail blasts did I do? How many opportunities did we influence? And that this was around the same time that marketers started having this schism. The marketers who were overreaching, trying to say that they created the revenue, and the other marketers who were like, let's just claim that we did the webinar. And that I think that there was a huge overreach in that first group, and it created a lot of problems with sales. So we made program analytics, which I have 2 patents. Both of them are relating to this period. I literally did math for a whole year of just figuring out like how things were going to work. How do we, things like first touch attribution and last touch attribution and multi-touch attribution. I had an intern named Karina Boo from Cal who was helping me with all of these charts and graphs of like an S curves of exactly how we were going to attribute things. She's a founder in her own right now of a company called Warmly. And when we made programs, I said, okay, people aren't going to just want to do this just for the analytics. We need to give them an extra reason to do this. And I said, the easy reason is you don't have to go to the design studio. You don't have to go to these other areas. You can just make your program with all the stuff in it right there. And we call those local assets. And I said, the local assets is the reason to make it easier for people to use the software, and that the benefit they'll get is the program analytics, the attribution. That you can't just go into the attribution. You have to give them a little bit of candy first, and then they'll take the attribution. And that was our biggest feature ever. That's a huge change from the way it worked beforehand. And the design of all of it with the different program types and success and how does it sync to Salesforce campaigns, it was all very intricate. And I really love the design that we put together for that. And then I got in this argument with Cheryl Chavez, who is the product management director, where she's like, we have to get it out the door. And I said, I don't think people will remember what month we delivered this thing, but they will remember how it made them feel when they first used it. And if it doesn't have these local assets, it will feel broken. And she insisted, we launched it, and everyone was upset. Everyone was super upset because they were just like, you made this big change, but why? It's like, there's no point. And it was only 2 months later that we released the full version. And then everyone was like, oh, this is great. We can use this. And then programs became a much more successful concept. But that was a very upsetting moment because I knew it was wrong. I knew it was going to cause us grief. And for what? For a couple of months, nobody remembers what month the feature came out. And I think that it was around that time that we were getting ready to go public. After we went public, it was always another story. We needed to tell an acquisition. Social was like a thing for like a few months. And then I'm like, nobody's going to use this. Nobody's going to care about this after it stops being the cool thing, the cool flavor of the month. And there was A/B testing. And I'm like, nobody's going to use this. And so we made it and it did a thing. But it was just one story after the next that sounded really cool. But like, I knew it wasn't something that was going to make a huge difference. And it was just about satisfying investors and about announcing things and acquisitions. We did so many acquisitions and I was like, why are we acquiring this company? They don't matter. We could build our own thing of this. It doesn't even do anything interesting. And I learned firsthand like the power of the quarterly report. And I think there's a tyranny to it that makes it so you have to make each story bigger than the last. You have to keep making like these acquisitions, and it's hard to integrate a company. And I think that to avoid this problem, to a certain degree, you have to separate out your product development from your investor relations. You have to say, investor relations, I know you want us to make a bunch of cool stuff, and we're not going to. And that you're going to have to tell your stories on your own. We're not going to acquire companies. We're not going to just make half-baked software. You guys are on your own to tell the story that you're going to tell. And to a certain degree, it will depress the stock a little. However, your customers will continue to love the product, and that will increase the stock price. And so I think it washes out in the end, but you just can't let your investor relations arm dictate your product development strategy. And I think this is very much a Steve Jobs way of thinking about things. That he would, when he came out with the iPhone, there was a bunch of people, and it's hard to imagine this at the time, who were saying, you're idiots. You're going to ruin your iPod business. Because they were just like, look how much money you make in iPod. You're going to cannibalize that business. Think of the mindset that you have to be in to say that Steve Jobs is an idiot for coming out with the iPhone. But that's literally what people said. And there's a bunch of videos of him talking about some of this stuff. One guy is giving him a horrible time about not understanding what the open doc format does or something like that. And he's trying to explain to the person that that's not how you build a great company. You build a great company by sticking to your values and by creating things that you think are great and taking the time it takes to do it. If you do great things, there'll be stories to tell. There'll be announcements. But if you focus on the announcement, you probably won't build a great thing.
And you know, I've wrestled with this a lot because I've seen them focus, Marketo and almost every other company I can think of that's reached this stage, focus more and more of their effort on products or new features or new modules that are going to add incremental bookings. So they want to roll things out that are going to increase contract value. Meanwhile, there's a backlog a million miles long of like features that users every day are like, I need this, I need this, I need this. And you can understand the logic as they say, well, no one's going to churn because of this one missing thing. So let's focus on this. And like, it's a spreadsheet math. And if you go against it, you just seem like you're this craftsperson who doesn't really understand economics and doesn't care about shareholder value, et cetera. But I think what they're missing and what you've described is this long game where like the product becomes less lovable. It loses its integrity, loses its value in the eyes of the people that use it most.
Two good examples of that in Marketo history is A/B testing. There was a sales VP who said, we have to have A/B testing. We keep losing deals because of A/B testing. And I'm like, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. And he insisted. So we built A/B testing. The analytics show that 97% of all users use it about 3% of the time. And that 3% of the users use it like 97% of the time. So in other words, there's this very, very small group of people that love it. And most people were like, I tried it once. And I remember a user once told me, you're killing me with A/B testing. And I asked them why. And they said, I used to only have to write one email. And now I need to write 2 emails. Thanks, Glenn. And I'm creating work for him. And on the flip side were tokens, which nobody asked for. Nobody asked for tokens, right? But I said, no, these are going to be cool. And it's because of my position in the company and I could just make certain things happen. And I just made tokens happen. Tokens ended up being like one of the most powerful features used by everybody, incredibly powerful feature. But nobody asked for it. And in the demo, you don't even like talk about it necessarily all that much. But it was one of those things that made Marketo what it was. That was maybe one of the last big features that were like that. Just came from a place of, this would be cool, right? Instead of a place of, this will tell a good story. So like A/B testing on the one hand and tokens on the other. Every company has the ability to do that kind of work. And they have people who know. But I think that product managers they're not taught how to do that. It's a lost art in product management. And most of the time product managers are feature people. They just want to like pummel the user with release features. And instead of thinking there's certain kinds of features that expand your story, like more flow steps might do that. There's certain ones that expand the surface area, like tokens allow for new kinds of things to happen. But most of the time, they're just like, well, they voted on these features. Let's do the ones that they voted for. It's a lack of imagination. But I think most companies, they have people who can do it. And I think as a society, we just don't value this very much. We don't value innovation. Like, we value it in the genius CEO, but we don't value it as a regular old job that people have. Most designers that I meet, they don't understand differentiation. They don't understand how to do real innovation. They don't understand how to think about products this way. And they're not being taught how to do it. And it's not being valued in them if they do it. It's very difficult. There's a lot of companies that hate me. They hate that I do this. And which is why I feel great when I land in a place of where they value it and they care about it. But real magic happens when you empower the people in your organization who get this kind of concept.
What do you think about HubSpot and as a product company and what they've been able to do? Because it seems to me that they have pursued a slightly different course than their peers in the marketing automation space and have continued to expand what they do, but in a way, like, it feels they haven't lost that mojo, so to speak. Or maybe it's gone up and down, but overall they still have this tight-knit, passionate group of users, and it still feels like they have that energy behind them. Do you share that perception? And if you do, why do you think that is?
I remember when I first saw them, they said they were marketing automation for the Fortune 50,000 or something like that, or the Fortune 5 million. It was very clever because Eloqua was clearly the enterprise. We were clearly the mid-market. And they said, we're going to take the low end. And I thought that was really smart positioning. Positioning is another concept that very often gets overlooked, but it's super important. You have to be in the middle. You can't be the too expensive one and you can't be the cheap one. You need to be the Goldilocks provider. And I think Marketo had that for a long time and then started to lose it, actually, as HubSpot started coming up. I think that their positioning was really smart. I remember seeing their UI and thinking there was some parts of it that were fine. They would put the responses on the landing page object itself. That instead of like a smart campaign where it's abstracted, they would say, oh, take the landing page, flip it upside down, and it says what to do when someone fills it out, which in some ways is like, that's clever and easy. In other ways, it's more limiting, right? But very often, limiting is not as limiting as you might think. And that if it's close enough that you can say, it's a religious war. I think it should be. And somebody else thinks it shouldn't be. And that way you get half the market. I think they did a really good job of their branding. I think they did an amazing job with their content. HubSpot content was stellar. And they did a lot of things that I think were close enough. That's the thing about a lot of software. Close enough is really fine. Then it becomes about your differentiation and about what you're doing. It's not all about the features. And I think they never focused on having the most features. So I wasn't ever the let's analyze the competitive product guy. I knew what we were doing and I focused on that. But I definitely appreciated their positioning, their marketing, their content, their willingness to try different things. I think that their play into CRM, lightweight CRM, was brilliant. Because then they were like, you don't need Salesforce. There was a lot of people who were just like sick to death of Salesforce. Whereas Marketo, you had to have Salesforce. You couldn't have Marketo and not Salesforce. There was a period where I thought Marketo was going to be acquired by Salesforce. And the CEOs, Mark Benioff and Phil Fernandez, got into it in some weird way. And the stories were how it didn't work out. But I just thought we were like a perfect fit for them. It just goes to show how you really don't know how things are going to turn out in the middle of it.
I want to, in the time we have left, switch gears a little bit and just think about AI. and open-ended topic. I know you're just someone who likes to think about technology and trends and where things are going. And I'd be curious for your read on the current situation, either AI impacting your workflow as a product designer, like AI for product designers, or just AI as being incorporated into products as a builder of things. Take it whichever direction you please.
It hasn't affected hardly anything from a make product perspective. It's definitely in the middle of the hype cycle right now, where it's the peak of expectations. And it'll probably fall into the trough of disillusionment at some point. I think that there's this very strong desire on the part of human beings to have a friend that can't escape. That it's not exactly a slave, but it's like it goes on my phone and it seems to have free will, but it can't betray me and it can't be mean to me. It has to always be nice to me, and it's like a friend. I think that that desire is nearly overwhelming in human beings, and that we desperately want this. And then along comes something like ChatGPT, and it talks, and it seems like it can't go anywhere. But then you realize it's kind of an idiot. I had said to ChatGPT, when I was younger, there was this poem about a coal miner who, when he went to work, his children were in bed unconscious. And when he came back home, his children were in bed unconscious. And in his mind, his children were in a coma, right? And it was only because he worked very long hours, early in the morning, late at night. And I had kids at the time, and it had made me sad of like working too hard. And so I said, ChatGPT, what is this poem? And I described it. And it goes, oh, yeah, I know what poem you're talking about. And it told me the author and the name of the poem, and it even listed the poem. I'm reading it, and I'm like, something's not right. This is not the poem. So I Google it, and I'm like, there's an author that it cited, but they didn't write this poem. And I was just like, so I said to ChatGPT, I can't find this poem. And they were like, oh, that's because I made it up. And I was like, okay, don't make up a poem. There is an existing real poem. And it goes, oh yeah, I got you. And I'm like, I just want to know the author of that poem, and I'll go find it. And it's like, yeah, it's this author, and here's the text. It wrote another poem, a completely new poem. And I'm just like, dude, what are you doing? And it's just like, well, I couldn't find the poem, so I made it. And it looked me dead in the eye and said, this is a real poem and a real author, and it was written in 1874, and it made a whole backstory for this poem. And I'm like, why are you lying to me? And the answer is because people want a confident answer. I don't want to not give you a confident answer. I was like, but I asked for the truth. And it goes, I don't really understand what you mean by truth. I understand what you mean by tell me the answer to a question. And I could write something that looks a lot like the answer to your question. It's not true. It's not real, but it looks a lot like the answer to your question. This is what we have today. This is what AI is. I remember way back, there was a famous Marketo sponsored bake-off of lead scoring. And they had like, I think it was Lattice or somebody, and it had an AI scoring thing. So we had the Marketo way, where you had rules, and you had the AI way. They let it bake. They let the sales happen. Turns out, 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Nobody won. But marketers overwhelmingly said, well, if it doesn't matter, then I'm going to do it the rules, because if I just have a button that does it, what do you need me for? Like, I want to be paid for doing work. And if there's a button to do my job, then that doesn't bode well for my career prospects. And so I don't think anybody truly wants AI to do their job. I think they want a slave on their phone that can't leave, and that's got to be nice to them, and that maybe can do some things for their job to make their job easier, but only insofar as it can't replace them. That as soon as it replaces them, it's a problem. But as long as it doesn't replace them, then being helpful is fine. For example, in Figma, if it named my layers for me, great. But if it came up with the differentiated point of view of like, oh, you should do tokens and here's how tokens should work, I don't think that's going to fly. But there's nothing that I've seen in any AI yet where it can do, honestly, anything relating to product development. I think an area where it might be good at is testing, like Selenium script writing, looking for vulnerabilities where like there's a buffer overflow problem and it could find that in the code and fix those kind of things. I think like code helpers, syntax helpers, all of that is useful. But for designers, maybe some illustrations. But even those, like, they're kind of terrible. I don't mean to pour water on everybody's idea of AI. I just think it's wildly overhyped and mostly based on a psychological need as opposed to a real technical ability.
Oh, I mean, that's really interesting. I've seen the same things that you've seen. I remember even coming up for the name of this podcast, I was like brainstorming ideas and it was like, give me a list of like 20 words like associated with this aesthetic. And it would give me a list of 20 words of which like maybe 7 were duplicates. I'm like, can you please just give me a clean list of 20 with no duplicates? It's like, oh, sorry, here you go. Again, the same, like that sort of thing. It's like, what? But then I've seen like, I'm using it to create images for my Substack. I'm like, give me an image of this in like a 1950s sort of cartoon jazz aesthetic. And like it does it. And it's got weird wonky things in it, but it's okay for my Substack. And to pay an illustrator to do that by hand would be completely cost prohibitive. And so it seems that there is this niche where you can use it to get things done or automate certain things that you would otherwise have to do. I agree completely that nobody needs to be replaced. And the psychological need of like the friend, that's almost the part that creeps me out the most, to be honest, because if you have someone who's always emotionally available, you know, can't ever not want to give you attention, etc., what use do you have for real human relationships after a point in time? And that's the part that scares me about AI.
I do worry about those things. At the same time, I feel that loneliness is a debilitating feeling. And there's a reason that having a friend on your phone is so useful. There's a reason why something like Twitter works. Like, people want to be heard so badly that they're willing to talk to crazy people just to get that. I think that we're living in incredibly interesting times. And yeah, we're making some cool products. We're also changing the world in a way that's very scary. We're certainly entering a post-truth world. And I think Adobe is more than any other company responsible for the capabilities of deepfakes. And that for your Substack illustrations, there's some designer out there that's like really bummed. He used to get work. And that's an area that AI is doing better than most. But what happens to those designers? What happens to humanity? Because one of the things about AI is also it's what it's fed. It only knows how to make the thing that has been made before, like a 1950s style or whatever. But what does a 2040s style look like? Nobody knows that yet. And if we're not training designers, if we're not giving designers a living, then who is going to make that?
We'll never have it. It'll just be endlessly regurgitated content back and forth into the model.
With that said, maybe we're becoming so efficient that people can have those sorts of jobs without it being a career. Like, I'm a big fan of universal basic income, where we can pay people enough to live, and so they can be artists without starving. They can be musicians without starving. I think that the world is changing. It's important for all of us to not be reactive, not just assume it's going to be bad, but also don't assume it's going to be good. We have to think about the details and keep trying to goose humanity forward so we make innovative things in new and different ways. Creativity, I think, is more a value that people will care about in the future, not less. The more AI, the more automation, the more technology helps us, the more that creativity matters.
And I think you can see it like in the rise of platforms like Etsy, which is specifically about like people valuing something handmade. And of course, all the like mass producers are snuck onto Etsy now as well and degrading the quality of that. But you're right, there is a hunger for something like, I want something built by hand, something that wasn't scaled, something that's unique, that's one of a kind. I know we're out of time, but Glenn, this was just a fascinating discussion. So glad you were able to join us today.
Thank you for inviting me. This has been great, and I really enjoyed talking with you today.
Hey everyone, I want to invite you over to the RevOps FM Substack community, where you can sign up to get rough transcripts, show notes, longer form articles, and other bonus content. Just head over to revops.fm/subscribe to get free access. I'd also love to know what you thought of the episode and to hear suggestions for topics you want to learn about. Feel free to leave a comment on Substack or send me an email at justin@revops.fm. Thanks for listening.